Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I want to talk about getting started with Azure Storage Queues. Let's go ahead and jump right in here. I have this basic demo application that is very simple. All we are doing is creating a basic web API in .NET 10, and then we have a single endpoint here, a sign up endpoint that accepts a request, and basically it simulates some time for processing and returns this mock access token. So let me go ahead and just run this and then we'll send the request. So it's running and I will go ahead and send this request. And as you can see, I get a response back 200 OK and my token response. So this is like a mock of a productions scenario where there is a sign up endpoint and you get a request and you handle the sign up and you return an access token so that they can continue to use the application after they sign up. So what I want to introduce here is a queuing mechanism that will allow us to remove some of this delay. So if you can imagine, we might be doing something like sending an email after they sign up, and all that work has to take place in this method before we return a token. So what I want to do is introduce a queuing mechanism, a simple queuing mechanism using Azure Storage Queues to basically queue up an event or the request itself, have the handler of that message do the processing asynchronously so that we can return back to the client as soon as possible and not force them to wait while we are doing background processing. So let's go ahead and get started. So one of the things that we need is obviously an Azure storage account. Let's go ahead and come over here, and I'm going to do this all from within my IDE, but you can certainly do this from the CLI or from the Azure website. But I'm just signed into my own personal account here, and I'm going to go ahead and create a new Azure storage account. I'm going to say SA Q demo 457 because I already have 456. It's just a random name. It has to be globally unique across Azure. And then I'm in my Azure Storage Demo resource group so that I can delete this when I'm done with this. And all the resources inside of that will be deleted as well. So I'm going to do a standard performance, and I just need locally redundant. That's going to be the cheapest option, which is fine for this demo. So we will create that and we will wait for it to complete. Okay, that is completed. So now, as you can see, we have this storage account. And if we look in here, there is no queues or anything. So let's go ahead and do the next thing. So the next thing we need to do then is to introduce some NuGet packages to our project here because we need a mechanism to be able to interface with the Azure Queue in Azure, and Microsoft provides us with an SDK to be able to do that. So there's two packages we need. The first one we need is Azure.Queues, Azure.Storage.Queues, and we are going to install this to the web API. And then we also need Microsoft.extensions.Azure. This is going to give us some extension methods for adding and registering services to our dependency injection container so that we can request those services in our endpoint here. So the first thing we need to do is add those services to our dependency injection. So before we build the app, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say, we can stop the app from running, builder.services.add Azure clients. This is exactly what I want. And this is coming from this namespace here, coming from that Microsoft extension.azure package that we added. So this gives us a client builder. Let's go ahead and jump in here. And basically we want to do client builder.add queue service client. And this is going to accept a connection string, although there's other ways that you can also register this or connect it to the actual storage account. One of those ways being a default Azure credential if you did not want to use connection strings. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to stick with connection strings, but in production, you definitely want to switch over to using a default Azure credential or a managed identity. But for the sake of this demo, I'm going to stick with connection strings. So sure, we can use this name. So all I'm saying is add me a queue service client, and I'm going to map it to this connection string. Okay, so this is not quite what I want. I want to do a configuration.get connection string, and we'll call it Azure Storage. That's totally fine. So we have Azure Storage, but I want to do some additional configuration on this. I want to say .with name. I'll just say with name. And here I want to actually make a shared constant that we can use because we don't want to be using magic strings, and this will make sense in a little bit when we actually implement the endpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here and create a class, and it's going to be storage account names. We'll make this a public static class, and in here we will say public const Azure Storage, and we'll just make that storage. So I have this constant here. I will come back over to program.cs. And now I want to say storage account names dot Azure Storage. Actually, I want to make this something a little bit better. So let's do primary, because primary-storage. Okay, so now I have this with name, storage account names dot primary. And then I want to also pass in some configure options on this. And so I will do options goes to options dot message encoding, queue encoding base 64. The reason for that is because the consumer of this message, after I put it in the queue, is going to be an Azure function. And by default, those are expecting a base 64 encoding on the message. And if we don't do that, it will immediately fail when it tries to read the message. Okay, so now we have a mechanism via dependency injection that we can request a queue service client in our endpoint to enable us to be able to interface with that Azure queue. So I'm going to update my endpoint here to say I need a Azure Client Factory of type queue service client, and we'll call it queue client factory. That's exactly what I want. So that's good. And so now we have access to this in our method. And in here, we can now instantiate an instance of the queue service client. And this is where the storage account names comes in handy, because we first need to get the queue service client. So we'll say var queue service client, and we'll call the create client method on the queue client factory here. And this is where we are making use of this storage account names, because we want to say, hey, I want to connect to this storage account because I could have many storage accounts. We're not going to be limiting this project or this API to only have one storage account, because in many cases you are having more than one storage account and you may want to use queues from differing storage accounts. So here I'm saying, give me an instance of this class that's connected to this storage account. And then from there, I can create my actual queue client, which is the class that will interface with the actual queues in the storage account. So we can say this, which is to say var queue client, get queue client from the service client, and then we want to get the actual name of the queue. Now, just like we did with the storage account names, I want to create a new class over here and call it queue names, make this a static class, and we'll just call the first one sign up. It's gonna be the name of our first queue. And then back over to program, we will now say, instead of this magic string, we will say queue names dot sign up, making use of those constants instead of magic strings. Okay, so now we have the queue client. Now we can actually send messages to the queue with this queue client here. And so let's remove this simulation of processing and instead say, okay, we create the account. Sure, there's still a little bit of processing there, but ultimately we are going to send this message to the queue. And you could, depending on what you wanted to do, you might have some more information after you save the user to the database or whatever. But for the purposes of this demo, I am just going to serialize the request itself and send that to the queue. So now if I run this, we would actually see this fail because there's nothing in our code that's actually creating this queue in the storage account. So there's a couple ways you can do that. Many ways, actually. You could put something in the startup of your application to ensure that those queues are created. You could have it be a manual thing where whenever you are, as the developer, creating a new queue, you would go and make sure that those exist across all environments, etc., etc. I'm not going to get into that in this video. So for now, for the purposes of this demo, I'm just going to manually create that. Or not even manually create that. I'm going to just say in here, await queue client.create if not exists. So again, you wouldn't want to do this in production because there's latency involved with each request of this because it needs to check first that the queue exists. So we're going to call that, that's going to create the queue, and then it's going to post the data to there. So let's go ahead and run this again, and I'll jump over to my HTTP file. Actually, let's put a breakpoint here, and then back to the HTTP file. Okay, so this is running, and now let's send my request. So I send this and we hit the breakpoint. So now I'm getting an exception here, and I know exactly what that is. It said, hey, this parsing of the connection string did not work. That's because up here, I said, hey, I want the connection string called Azure Storage, but I did not update my connection string to actually do that. So let me come here and put this in here. So I have the property name, but we need to actually get that connection string from Azure. So come over here. I actually don't think I can get it from here. I can't copy connection string. So I'm going to copy that, and I'll come over here and I will paste that. So I now have a connection string to my storage account. And so let's try running this again and jumped over to the HTTP file and we'll run this. I hit my breakpoint, I step over this, Now I don't have that exception because I properly put the connection string in my settings. And so now I can use that queue service client, and I can use that queue service client to then create the actual queue client to interface with my queue on the storage account. Then I'm going to go ahead and run this line of code, which creates the queue, or at least creates it if it doesn't exist. So I'm going to step over that. And then if we go over here and we refresh this, we come down here and we expand our queues, you can see that there is now a sign up queue. If I step over that and then return to the client, this runs without problem. And I can actually, there's no way for me to view the data in the queue from this, which is fine. I'm only sharing this application in my screen recording here, so we can't actually look at the message in the queue, which I thought I could. Oh well. Let's go ahead and jump over to our code again. And now what we want to do is create a consumer. And once we have that consumer, you'll be able to see that it is actually reading the message that we just put in the queue from the function here. So what I want to do is come over here and I will add a new Azure function trigger. I'm just going to make this a sign up consumer. I did not want to do a blob trigger. Delete, add sign up consumer. And we're going to come down here and get the queue trigger template. Here we are. We can stop the application from running. And so now we are in this function here. And then all I need is to specify which queue is this function going to listen on. And so once again, I get to make use of my queue names, import the namespace, and then my connection, which is which storage account is this function listening or connected to. So I have my local settings here, and this is looking at Azure Web Drop Storage, which is going to work just fine. So I'll come back over here and say, you listen on that. And then let's grab our connection string again, which I can just grab from secrets. Again, this is all going to be removed. So it doesn't matter that I'm showing my connection string here. Back over here in local settings, I will paste that in. So then we can actually just run this, and I'm not going to implement any kind of logic here. I am just showing how you can get started with Azure Storage Queues. So now we've created a consumer of that queue, and we're going to read that message into this code. And so let's go ahead and do this, and we will run this. Okay, and here we are. We're at my breakpoint running this function, and you can see that we have got our message here, which is a queue message. And the message text is actually this first, the serialized version of that class of that sign up request body. So there you have it. We have now properly kind of done the whole end-to-end flow of queuing a message and then reading that message from another process, in this case an Azure function. And so we've decoupled the additional async work that we need to do on the sign-up endpoint, and we're now processing that in a function. So we can eliminate some of the processing time that's needed for signing up and give the user a better experience. So one of the other things that I want to show you before we wrap up here is we can actually bind directly to our model here. So if this is a sign-up request message dot email. And so let's go ahead and first run our API, and we will send another request. Okay, so now we have a message in the queue. We'll go back to our sign up consumer and we will debug this again. And as you can see, we are now at my breakpoint, and we've properly serialized the data from that queue message right into our custom model. So we don't have to go between that message text, that queue models that's coming out of this namespace here. And you can just bind the queue message directly to your class in the code here, which is very useful. So as you can see, there's very minimal setup needed to get started with Azure Storage Queues. All you need to do is basically register that queue service client to dependency injection, and then you can request access to that via dependency injection in your controllers or minimal endpoints. And then from there, you can use this kind of pattern here where you first specify, I want to get the queue service client associated with this storage account, and build your queue based on the queue name. It's a very repeatable pattern. So first you need to say, I want this storage account, and then give me the queue from the storage account. You have this 2 lines of code here to get the actual queue client that you want to work with. So as for the actual Azure queue storage itself, these are great for, simple queuing where you just want to decouple a process from the main endpoint and handle some work asynchronously. It doesn't need to be part of the main code path. But in terms of like reliability and robustness, if you needed something like message reliability and retries and all that kind of thing, you'd want to go with a different service that has all that baked in. This is a very elementary queuing mechanism with simple, I just need a queue. I want to add a message to a queue, I want to consume it with some other piece of code, and I'm not too worried about deliverability, ensuring that the message is only delivered once, etc., etc. I want to go with a more robust solution for that use case. So I would say that I've used Azure Storage Queues in production scenarios, and if you do run into issues, you do get something out of the box with Azure Functions, where if this function fails when it consumes the message, then it will add the message to what's called a poison queue, which is simply like the name of the queue here followed by a dash poison. So if this fails to process the message gets added to that poison queue. So you can monitor that or have some kind of logic based on that, but it is not like a fully robust system. It doesn't have like dead letter queues and stuff like that. So just keep that in mind if you are going to get started with these. Make sure they fit your use case properly. So that is all I have for you today. Hopefully you found this useful, and I will see you again in the next video.